Clipping masks are a very useful tool in Adobe Illustrator, and there are two ways to make them, and one of them is quite a lot better than the other. Unfortunately, the less good way, we'll call it, is what's most commonly taught. Especially, I looked for a while in YouTube videos and online, and I could find almost no tutorials that taught both ways or that explained how one is particularly better than the other. So that's what I want to do in this video. I want to look at both methods, and I want to explain why I think one is a little bit better than the others. But first, we need to talk about what clipping masks are and why they're useful. So I have a map here, and you can see it's got a margin around it. It doesn't go all the way to the edge of the page. And the reason for that is because I have a clipping mask. I've actually got extra map data that goes all the way, in fact, beyond the page edge, but you can't see it. It's being hidden. And I'm just going to turn my mask off for a second. You can see where all my map data go. And I've got land and boundaries and water all the way out past the page edge. But when I turn my clipping mask back on, it's all hidden. And that's what clipping masks do. This is a rectangle here. If I select it, you can see its shape. That just tells Illustrator, hide everything outside the rectangle. It doesn't have to be a rectangle. I could make it any shape that I want. I can change the corners here. I could resize it a little bit. No matter how I change it, though, Illustrator always looks to that shape and then chooses to hide everything outside of it. I'm just going to undo and get us back to where we were here. This is valuable because what it means is that I can carry extra map data that I don't see, but I might want later. If I turn the mask off, again, we've got all this map data outside of the page edge that's hidden. And what that means is that if later on I decide I want to show more map, I've got the flexibility to do so. I could expand my mask. I could bring it out to the edge of the page if I want, for example. And I have map data there. I didn't have to redraw anything. I didn't have to re-export from GIS, etc. So it's pretty common in my workflow to carry extra map data around just so that I never find myself caught short if I need to make some changes later on. So that's kind of what they're useful for in the most basic sense. So I'm going to get rid of this mask, and we're going to make one. We're going to look how they're constructed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct a circle here. And we're going to go through the first way of making a mask. And in this case, it's just going to be a circle because I think it's kind of an interesting shape. So what I've done is I've got a circle drawn and selected. And what I need to do is select all the other stuff that I want that circle to clip. And so I'm going to select my clipped layer and all the stuff inside. And you can see I've got a boundaries layer with some countries and states. I've got polygons layer, land layer, background layer. They've all got stuff inside them. They're just sublayers under my clipped layer. So I've got my whole map selected right now, plus my circle. And my circle is on top, and that's important because the thing that's on top, highest in the hierarchy, becomes the mask. And then I go to Object, Clipping Mask, Make. And it's clipped everything to that circle. This is the way that's most commonly taught for making clipping masks. But there are some problems with it. If you notice my clipped layer, there's no more art in there anymore. Everything is completely empty. If I go up to where I drew the circle in my temporary layer, there's a clip group there now. And if I expand it, this is where all my stuff went. All the different paths, all the different shapes, all the polygons, all the colors, all that went in here. But if you see, they're all on the same level hierarchically. There's nothing left of my original map hierarchy. All of my layers have been destroyed, basically, and everything's been lumped into one group. So all that organizational work I did before was for naught. Also, since it's all in one group now, it makes it really hard to select things. If I want to use the black arrow tool to select one polygon here, this blue one, for example, ordinarily on my map I might expect to just click on that polygon to select it and make changes or maybe move it around. But when I try moving things, it's actually, you can see down here, it selected the entire group. It selected my whole map, and that's what it's moving. So it makes it really hard to access the individual items of my map anymore because it's all grouped. So this is generally, while it's the most common way to make clipping masks that's taught, I think it's pretty destructive. It ruins a lot of your hierarchy, and I don't think it's the best way. So I'm going to undo here and back up to where we were before, where I just had an ellipse on top. And we're going to make them a different way, make a new mask. I'm going to take this mask and I'm going to drag it down to my clipped layer and make sure it's the top thing in that layer. Clipping masks, no matter which way you make them, they're always the top thing. Now, I've highlighted my clipped layer by clicking on it. Right, it doesn't matter what I have selected right now, it just matters what layer I have highlighted. And I've highlighted my clipped layer. I'm going to hit this button down here in the bottom. And this is the Make or Release Clipping Mask button. And when I hit that, it looks pretty similar to before. I've got everything masked. Everything outside the circle is hidden. I can click on a piece, you can see it's still there, it still exists, but it's not shown. But all of my layers are still intact. My polygons layer has polygons in it. Right? My boundaries layer, my land layer, they all have their stuff inside. So this is a non-destructive way of doing it. And the way it works is when you have a layer highlighted and you click this button, it looks for the very first thing in the layer. And the top thing is my ellipse that I drew, the circle. And it uses it to clip whatever else is in that layer. In this case, all the sublayers and their contents. It doesn't clip anything outside this layer. If I were to select this temporary layer here and draw something in it, that doesn't get clipped. I can move it below or above, it doesn't matter. It's everything in the clipped layer, because that's the one where the mask is active, and the mask is the first thing in the layer, and anything else that wasn't first in the layer gets clipped to that thing. This is a nice non-destructive way of doing it. I can select any of these polygons, I could move them around, I could change them with the black arrow like we might expect in our original map. Nothing's lumped together. So this is, I would say, the far superior method. And I'm not sure why it's not taught as often, because I really haven't seen any advantage to the first method that I showed you, except my only guess would be perhaps it is older in the software and more people got used to it. I don't know if this layer clipping method is newer. I would guess so, and maybe it just hasn't caught on as much yet. There are a couple other things I want to show you about clipping masks while we're here. I am going to turn off this mask for a minute so we can see most of the map, and I'm going to zoom in down here. So you see we've got this polygon going out into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm just going to flip the fill in the stroke for a second so you can see its outline, and you can see there's some land and some water underneath. What I'd really like is to make this polygon exactly match the coastline, but it would be a real pain to draw it piece by piece to match that coastline and get all those little islands, etc. But what I can do instead is keep this polygon whole, and I'm just going to flip it back, and instead clip it to the coastline. So if you look at my polygons layer, I've got all these different color shapes, but I've got one thing on top that's invisible. It's an invisible version, it's got no fill, no stroke, that's what I mean by invisible. It's an invisible version of the land boundary. Right now it's not doing anything, it's just no fill, no stroke, not doing anything at all. But since the top thing in the polygons layer, if I click the polygons layer and make a mask, all the other color polygons get clipped to it. So now that pink area perfectly matches the coastline. It didn't have to do anything really complicated to get it to match. It's still there, it's, the whole thing is just this giant blob that's kind of drawn out into the water, but it's all hidden. So I often make use of this. If I need to get two things to align, I might draw one to be larger than the other and then just have it get clipped by a land boundary or something like that. Same thing up here. I've got some state and country boundaries that happen to go out into the water, and it just so happens I have, once again, the land-water boundary invisible waiting on top to be turned into a mask. And so now those are hidden and they're ready to go. One or two other things I want to show you. First off, I'm gonna take this ellipse and I'm gonna make it a little larger so we can kind of see more of our map here. And I want to focus for a minute on the land-water boundary. The reason all of my background water is blue is because I've just got a shape behind it. It's just a simple polygon. You can see there, nothing fancy about it. It's just a sort of bluish polygon. But I actually don't need a background layer if I have a clipping mask. I'm going to delete this thing instead. It turns out if you take a clipping mask, like this circle, and give it a fill color, that becomes the background to the layer. So I can click to make it green or red, or in this case my original blue color that I had in my swatches palette. And now anything that's clipped by that ellipse gets that color. Nothing else does, but anything that's within the clipping mask gets a new background. So I don't need a separate background layer, which is kind of nice. It's a fun little trick. So, one other thing actually I want to mention before we leave off too is that if I take this mask and I want to disable it again permanently, I can disable it temporarily by just using the eyeball, but if I want to permanently disable it, I can click the Make Release Clipping Mask button again once I highlight the layer name that I want to affect, and it goes away. And you can see in this case it kept its fill color, which is fine. I'll just delete that now. But one thing that happened is that it also accidentally took away the clipping mask that I had on my polygons layer. Now this is back to just an invisible land boundary and on my boundaries layer. So any sublayers you have that have clipping masks, those get turned off. And you have to turn them back on one at a time if you're going to turn off a clipping mask in a layer above. So just something to keep an eye on if you kind of get into complicated nested hierarchies like I often do, because I've got all these layers stacked together so that I can clip them all at the same time. So I tend to use a lot of layers within layers. So that's sort of the power of clipping masks and how I like to make them. So I hope you make use of that and spread the word to others. Thanks.